Hello everyone, welcome to What If Issei Becomes the True Dragon of Rias Gremory Season 2 Part 3. Before we start, please go support marcusbm2005 for writing that awesome fanfic. Now let's begin. Chapter 5. Anger Issues. Underworld, Gremory Territory, teammates' garden home. Yeah, since I am the king of the place, so I need to stay there a certain amount of time each year, or else I lose my… Hey, are you okay? Issei asked as he noticed how quiet Jolina had become. She had been sitting still at his side, tugged up against him somewhat, and had been as quiet as a mouse for the last few seconds. Issei had only thought she might have been against going there, but now he felt it might be something else. Jolina didn't answer him, she just kept quiet and looked into her cup as small flashes of an old image flew by her, blocking the view of the reflected bright, golden and concerned eyes looking back at her. She was almost in her own little world, with only a small and still lingering connection to the real one. That being the warmth she still felt from Issei. "Jolina, are you okay?" Issei asked again, this time with a bit more worry. He even nudged her a bit with his arm, which seemed to wake her from her thoughts. "Yeah? What is it?" Jolina stopped herself as the last few seconds came back to her, making her remember the small flashes going past her. She also now noticed those two golden lights that had been in the background of the passing flashes. They were Issei's. She turned her head around towards him, her eyes looking at him in an apologetic way. "Oh, I'm sorry. I just got a lot on my mind, I guess. Sorry," she said as she then looked away again, feeling a bit embarrassed by her sudden lack of attention. But even more than that, she felt scared. Scared of the images of that night, of the story she had been told of that magical forest. She had always wanted to go there, but now she felt fearful of the idea. Her breathing became quicker as her head began spinning, making Jolina feel overwhelmed by it all. Issei noticed this, becoming even more worried than before. He tried to grab a hold of her shoulders to calm her down. "Jolina. It's okay, it's okay. I am here for you." He felt a sudden shove to his stomach as he fell back a bit and his arms let go of Jolina. "Oh," Jolina said as her head was hanging low and her hair covering her frightened eyes, making the two unable to have eye contact and Issei unable to see how she felt fully. "Don't act like you can. Like you can always help me. I said I was fine, so I am fine, got it?" She seemed aggressive, something that shocked Issei as he could swear he heard quiet sobs from her. It even surprised her how she was saying this, because she would have said something different if not for the answer Issei gave her a few seconds after. "But ain't we friends? I thought friends helped each other." Jolina stood up suddenly, her face still hidden, but this time not because of her hair, but because she didn't look at Issei. She was angry, hurt and sad. Why did he call her that? Weren't they more than just friends at this point? Or had she just gone too far in her own assumptions again? Or did Issei truly not want anything beyond this relationship they had? Was I just a friend all this time? She turned towards him, letting him see the pain in her eyes. "Jolina, I am sorry. If you could just tell me what's wrong, then maybe what? You can be an amazing friend and help me. But the big hero of the day. But that I said I am fine, so I am fine," Jolina yelled, interrupting Issei, who found himself to be even more confused at her actions. From how she had gone from seeming joyous to then deep in thought, sad and now angry at him. He wanted to talk back, try and apologize, but he didn't know what for. He had said this a few times in the last few days he had known her, but this time it seemed different. He tried to stand up, but one look from her made him decide to keep still and listen. "What? Can't you talk back anymore? Do you think I am being rude? Well, who is it who keeps me bound to the hip all day long?" She herself didn't really know where all these words were coming from anymore, but she couldn't stop. It was as if she had held all these little things inside her, and now that she had been given a chance to let some of it out, something in her made her go overboard with it. "You and everyone in your family, you all think I am dangerous if I am alone, without one of you to watch over me, but here is the thing, I am a bucking dragon emperor, the red dragon Emprese, and I will not let anyone control me or think that I need their help all the time." "Is that bucking understood?" Jolina yelled, loud enough for the few members of the garden staff to hear. They became worried for their young lord, even some for his guest. One even went back to the house to call for Grafia to come help. Jolina kept breathing heavily and fast as she was regaining her breath after all the yelling she had just done. Yet her anger nor pain hadn't faded, as Issei still hadn't said anything back to her. He hadn't yelled at her or become angry himself. He had instead kept looking at her with his golden eyes, with an unsure expression on his face, as he had seemingly decided to let her vent out her frustration, some of which she didn't even know she had. But that look in his face didn't help. It made her angry that he wouldn't fight back, that he just took it all lying down, at least that was how it looked to her. "Aren't you going to say anything?" Heavy breathing. "Aren't you going to fight back? I am just so far beneath you that me yelling at you means nothing?" Jolina asked, her voice having become a bit dry after her tantrum earlier. Issei still didn't speak back because he still didn't know what to say to her. But he felt hurt. He tried to say something, but it only came out as a whisper, too unsure of itself to be heard by others. He lowered his head down, feeling lost, shame and pain over this whole thing. He didn't know what he had done to make her this mad, and all the things she said to him didn't help him figure it out. She was just angry and had chosen to verbally abuse him and his family. He felt hurt because he couldn't stand to hear it, but he couldn't deny that she didn't have a point with some of the things she was saying. "You really are pathetic for a dragon." Jolina said to his chose to stay silent, and that should have been it, until something in her made her go just one step too far. "Your mother must have been worse than mine if you ended up like this," Issei, Jolina said coldly, feeling the satisfying feeling of winning, yet it had been an unneeded victory. And that was when she felt she regained control of body and words again. It hadn't been this thing inside her who had said all those things, it had just been her all the way through, but something made her want to not admit it. She felt horrible at this sense of victory she was feeling inside her, but worse yet was how hurt Issei looked. Even without her being able to see his eyes, she could sense he was hurt, very hurt. And it was all her thought. She wanted to, no, she had to apologize for this. But it seems she might have gone too far, for when she reached out to him, he slapped her hand away with his tail, scratching her hand as it happened. "Don't touch me." Issei stood up slowly, as his hair began to trickle and make crack sounds, as if a fire was slowly starting up. His eyes though, when she finally got to see them again, were burnt out. Not looking bright nor shining, but instead they looked like a normal pair of eyes, but much duller and angry. "You can say anything you want about me, my family, my life. Anything," he said as came to his full height, still standing an inch or two short of Jolina, yet even that seemed to change as his body began to grow bigger and his voice began to deepen. "But I will never accept lies or unkind words against my mother. I will not let her name or deeds be looked down upon, nor turned into gossip of you weaker beings." Issei's body began to morph slowly as his head began to stretch out, with his back gaining a pair of new limbs. His legs and arms began to seem more leg-like, with his toes and fingers being turned into ivory claws. Jolina could hardly stand in his presence, as she felt his anger and his pain being put on her. This was her punishment, and she knew it. Issei's body was already well over 20 meters long within the next few seconds, and he still kept growing. His former tan skin had been replaced by many dull-looking crimson scales. His eyes had still not regained its former shine, as they kept looking at Jolina with anger and pain, before looking elsewhere into the sky. Then he began to speak again, but he sounded so much more hurt than before. "Be grateful that I let you stay at my side after this day. If you were anyone else, then this would have been the end of your life. Meet me at the entrance to my home on Friday night," he said, still looking into the slowly darkening sky, before flapping his wings without much concern for the rooftop, nor for Jolina. She could hardly move and was left to just stand and watch the figure of Issei flying further and further away from her. "Issei," said Jolina softly, as she weakly reached out after him with one hand. She felt her heart freeze as the warmth of Issei left her fully. "What have I done?" 87 years ago, familiar forest, burned plains. Out in the midst of the almost ever-expanding familiar forest, with its mainly forest-like theme, hence the name, it also housed other kinds of habitats to suit other kinds of familiars' needs. It had swamps, mountain ranges, large portions of deserts and much denser forests than just the main one. It also used to have a lush and bright green plain of grass, an area where some of the weaker, yet much more beautiful-looking familiar normally would gather, until its first inhabitant burned the whole place to the ground for his own sack. Thus it had come to be known as the Burned Plains, as it stretches out over quite some distance. It houses many more creatures nowadays than when it had been created, with most of them being of the weaker sort and some being simply brave to live near its de facto ruler. A huge crimson-red dragon roamed this place as its ruler and owner. Back when he was a kid, he had burned most of the place just so he could live there without his mother scolding him. His name was Issei Madison, the son of the queen of the familiar forest. He had also become the godchild of Rias Gremory. Back when his mother and her became friends when he was in a long coma, making him also a member of the Gremory family, but not as Graphia's child, more like her younger brother. He had over half a century ago been awakened to his principle of power. Sunlight. A weak and maybe even a little uncool sounding power, yet a dangerous one nonetheless. He was currently lying on the ground just outside his burrow and watching the red sun as it flew slowly across the purple sky. A weird sight to most newcomers, but a relaxing one to the people born under its light. But Issei wasn't there to sun gaze, but rather to find a way to solve a problem he had been having for half a decade now. How do I get Akeno 1E to stop teasing me? A problem he would likely never find an answer to, besides acting sad all the time, that seemed to work. But his question did earn him an interested and amused giggles from a nearby woman. He looked to his side, becoming wide-eyed at the sight of her, his mother, wearing one of her less than suitable dresses in her human form again. Mom, he yelped as he closed his eyes and almost dug his head in the ground beneath him as teammate giggled even more before it became a laughter at his childlike reaction. What? Don't I look good in it? I mean, even if it leaves little to the imagination, and especially with how big my stop please mother, you are too embarrassing, Issei yelled towards her, still having his eyes closed. She laughed a bit more at him for his cute reactions before she came closer. As she went, she snapped her fingers once, and the rather indecent clothes she had gotten from Akeno were transformed into her normal and much more suitable one. It's all fine now. But I do feel a little hurt since it seems my red gem doesn't think his mother looks beautiful when she wears nice clothes. HMP. She pouted jokingly, both trying to tug at his heart, yet also just to see more cute reactions from him. He knew he couldn't win in the situation, so it was either him saying sorry and agreeing to her looking good in whatever new and unladylike dress she had on that day. Or her teasing him about it for the rest of the week if he just said yes to begin with. Fine. You look nice in it. Just please stop wearing them out in the open like this, mother. Issei begged as he raised his head from the comforts of the ground beneath him, feeling relieved that his mother was now wearing something suitable. She stopped pouting and patted him on the side of his head as she smiled a cheerful smile. Oh, so you do think your mother looks beautiful. Such a naughty boy, Issei. I must have gone wrong somewhere as I raised you if you find your mother attractive. Teammate teased, earning herself low growls of frustrations from her son as he had once again walked right into one of her traps. But I'll allow it for today. But back to your problem, dear, what's bothering you? She asked as she jumped up onto his right front leg, gaining herself a clear eye contact with him. Issei turned his right eye from his mother onto the son again as he began to talk. It's not really bothering me, it's just sometimes she just says things that get under my skin. And then I get mad, mother. Issei said as he looked back at his mother, who nodded understanding his problem. On paper it was rather basic, but it was a problem, and with how far Akeno could sometimes if she was thinking straight, it could become a bigger problem in the future. I see. I don't know what to say that could help, but I do know that Akeno doesn't mean what she is saying. It's just her way of communicating, my red gem. Teammate said as she caressed his front leg as a way to make him relax. I know that. But she could just talk to me like a normal person instead of having to go so far. Issei said as he thought of all the weird ways she had gotten to talk with him. If not by just tricking him into meeting her in weird places or by lying or asking someone else to send him there. Then she had also tried to lure him in with Hexwell teasing. That approach was quickly and thankfully stopped by Rias, but then it just became even worse when she would still try to use it. She had also snuck into his bedroom sometimes, or into his bath. Issei hardly believed she was just trying to tease him, but that was until he learned she only really did this with men she was close with, which meant she only did this to him, Gasper and Kiba. Hopefully. Though he had never heard either of those two ever complaining about it, making him come to the conclusion she was only doing it to him. But all those things were fine, sometimes at least. But what really made him angry was when she would speak about his mother in a bad way. He hadn't blown up in her face about it, at least not yet, not like he did with others who weren't as close to him as she was. But he feared that one day she would say something he couldn't forgive or let her get away with. I am afraid one day she might do something that would make me unable to forgive her. I don't want to lose her, but I also don't want to listen to her, jokes. Issei said as he looked hopefully at his mother, hoping she could give him a hand with this. I see. That is a tough dilemma. You know, I went through a similar thing when I was young with my siblings. Teammate said, somewhat reminiscing of her own childhood, with her siblings or rather her old friends, but at the time they were just all so close that they all felt like hatchmates, or siblings. Siblings. You have siblings, Mom? Issei asked, curious about his mother's past. Plus the possible new uncles and aunts he could get to meet, though his mother stopped that from happening before it went too far. Yeah, I had siblings. They died in the Great War as some of the few dragons casualties in that war. They were my oldest friends and helped me to get over my heartbreak when my old mate left me for his stupid dreams. Teammate said as she could remember old and fickle memories of her siblings. She made small circles on Issei's claws as she went quiet for a bit before she began hers and Issei's little trip down her memory lane. We used to fight a lot with each other. We would do dumb things to get each other's attention, which was normally the start of most our fights. She said as she looked over towards Issei's golden and intrigued right eye. It made her smile that he seemed so interested in her past, even though it was long gone. Back then I was no more than a small fry. I was weak, skinny and not very attractive, well they all became loved by almost everyone around them among our people. Yet they kept me close to them, even though I began to try and mess with them, so I could feel like I had their attention, even though I already had it. Teammate said as she giggled a bit at the time she tricked her older brother while he was with his mate. The prank had been so bad that they broke up, and while her brother was angry with her, he still forgave her for it. So I would do stuff like Akeno does to you. I would try and get their attention any way I could because I felt so insecure at the time. And I think Akeno is doing the same with you. Tiamat said, smiling a knowing smile as she saw the look in Issei's right eye, like he had maybe realized something. He had, since he began to notice how, when Akeno teased him in the past, it always seemed to happen when he was with the others, working on his powers or when he was just by himself. Maybe Tiamat had a point about her just wanting his attention, since he felt now that maybe he had not been talking enough with her. I think you're right, mother. Maybe I should try and talk more with her. Thanks mother. Issei said, raising his lips a bit as he sent his mother a toothy smile, with her sending back her own, less toothy, smile. Good to hear my red gem. Tiamat said as she patted the side of his eye proudly, before she snapped her fingers again and stood up in the revealing clothes once more. But seriously Issei, does my butt look big in this or what? Tiamat asked, sounding genuine as she turned her back towards Issei, who began whimpering again at the sight. Mother, please no. Present time, Gremory territory, Kaneko's residence. In the early morning of another, rather boring, yet regular Wednesday, the family of only 4 female Nekomata were awakened to quite the sight, one their neighbors shared as well. Outside in their small mansion-sized garden, behind their small mansion-sized townhouse, surrounded by white, blue and yellow flowers, laid the sleeping body of a very familiar crimson dragon. Kaneko, her wife Nin, their teenage daughter, Hanin and Kaneko's older sister, who was still single despite her best efforts, Kuroka, all stood in the opening of their garden door, still in their night clothes and just watching in awe as Issei slept in the middle of their now trampled garden. I think I'll go back to bed now. Wake me up if he asks for me. Kuroka said as she put all her weight on her left heel, before spinning around and going out of the garden entrance, before entering the main entrance hall and going up the stairs to the bedrooms. Mama, why is Uncle Issei sleeping in our garden? And why on my catnip? Hanin's mouth was closed suddenly as Nin used a shinjitsu to stop her from saying too much about their little secret. Catnipple flowers, right honey? Nin asked Hanin, who began nodding very fast as she realized what she had almost said to her mama. Kaneko just took another sip from her coffee, ignoring her wife and daughter's terrible try at hiding their secret from her. Catnip, at least to supernatural cat-like beings, is not so much a drug as it just is what a cigarette is to a human, a stress relief plant without too many of the same health problems. Catnipple flowers are only different in the way that it isn't addictive, unlike catnip, but it does similar things, but just to a lesser extent. I don't know honey, but trust me your uncle is going to pay for whatever he trample, especially if it's my chocolate tree. Kaneko said as she put down her coffee cup and went out the door. She didn't care about both the weird and perverted looks she got from her neighbors as she was still wearing her nightgown, a white and silky robe covering her, with her wearing a black pair of shorts and a black sports bra under it, only leaving her well-muscled stomach, legs and arms to be seen. Something Nin loved. She reached the left side of his head, feeling his hot breath blow at her robe, letting her neighbors see her toned legs, and making her wife feel lightheaded. Hanin just felt indifferent, caring more about her drugs. Issei. She first whispered near his eye, trying to wake him calmly first. It didn't work, so she tried again a bit louder, and again. Then on her 4th try, she put her left foot behind her, lifted her robe's right arm sleeve, making her wife wonder if she was in heat or what, since she felt her head going slowly blank, just from the sight of Kaneko's toned arm. Wake up, Issei. The small figure of Kaneko should never be seen as being weak, because every centimeter of her body is strong enough to wake up a heavenly dragon, with only a single punch. A deep whimper or whine of pain was heard, only a bit after Kaneko had punched his nose, a sign that Issei was awake. What the hell, Jolina. Wait. Where I am? Issei yelled, still holding back a well-deserved morning yawn, though his anger was replaced by his confusion at where he was, though that became clear as he noticed his older sister, in her nightgown, standing in front of him with a morning smile. As in an indifferent and tired smile, since Kaneko doesn't really smile in the morning, unless it's Candy Sunday. Kaneko. Why the hell am I at your house? Issei said as he carefully tried to stand up, trying his best to avoid trampling any other plants, beside and very unfortunately, the catnip. That's what I would like to know. Transform into your human form and come inside, I'll make a new can of coffee. Kaneko said as she turned around and started walking back inside, but not before stopping in front of her kid and wife, sending them both a disappointed look. Catnip? Really? No more hugs, kisses, Sunday candy or as phone for the rest of the month. Kaneko said as she passed her now dead wife and kid as they each lost too much in such a short time. Issei was rather confused by what had happened between the 3 of them, but decided he should stay out of it since Kaneko could be a bit of a lion mom when it came to things like this. Inside in the living room, after much struggle from 2 of the 4 gathered people eating at the table, Kaneko and Issei began to talk as Nin and Hanin just sat in silence. So why were you out in my garden of all places? Don't you basically have the entire Gremory Gardens to trample on instead? Asked Kaneko, as she took another sip of her freshly brewed coffee, as she watched Issei, who barely seemed to touch his cup or his food for that matter. I am sorry, sister. Issei struggled a bit with what he wanted to say, since he barely knew where to start with the whole thing. Practical everything from the start of that sudden change in Jolina to him leaving was just one big jumble of feelings, words and pain. And almost anything after had been a blur to him, with only small glimpses of it still intact in his mind. He put his left hand under his chin and flopped some of his finger inside his mouth, showing his sharp teeth off, though unlike normally his niece Hanine didn't care. She was too depressed at the moment. Kaneko, seeing that as well as the confused look in his eyes, reached over with both of her hands, grabbing his right hand and massaging it softly to calm him. It's okay, Issei. Just say whatever you need to say, I am here for you. Kaneko kept massaging his hand, even sending some comforting shinjitsu magic his way through her hands. It helped Issei, since he could start to slowly make an order of his thoughts on that whole argument they had yesterday. Thanks. I still don't really understand what happened. I mean suddenly Jolina just became angry at me. I left my home and said I would come back on Friday. Issei said as he moved his left hand out of his mouth and up from his chin and over his eyes to cover them. By Lilith's kindness, I am the worst host ever, he said, earning him a few disagreeing tsk from Kaneko. You are not the worst host ever. At least not compared to my sister. Hey, I heard that, so don't be so harsh on yourself. Go on and try maybe to add a bit more detail. Kaneko said, hardly caring that she had roasted her sister within her earshot as she was more focused on helping Issei. Issei sighed at first as he tried to retell the events of yesterday's afternoon coffee time on the roof, which had then turned into Jolina becoming angry at him, venting her anger on him, about his family and then his mother. Kaneko knew that last bit wasn't a good one to use when screaming or yelling at Issei, especially when he is already having a hard time understanding why people were suddenly sad or angry at him. It was like both the perfect way for him to end the argument with people, but it also had the downside of being the most surefire way of him ending someone's life. Luckily, Jolina had managed to make herself liked enough for Issei's anger to not kill her on the spot, but instead leave her all alone as he ran away from the problem. It's the kind of situation that neither side likes to be in, since none of them feel like they won or that they were right at the end of it, since it only ever left losers and no winners. Kaneko had been in a few of these arguments before with her family and had learned from every one of those fights that these things were always inevitable in some sense, and the only thing that mattered was how you dealt with it afterwards. She wouldn't say it to his face, at least not right now, because she knew he would probably just beat himself up about it on the inside, but the way he handled it wasn't the best. 1. He had basically threatened her with her life. 2. He had not given her a chance at all to say sorry, not that she had either. And 3. He ran away from her and left her to wallow in her own self-hate and regret all alone, instead of in silence with him nearby, while he could talk about it with her. She sighed, finding this problem to be exhausting, and it was just the start of the day. I am sorry. Really, I am. So can I please stay here until Friday? I know it won't fix the problem, but I just can't see her right now, not after that. Issei said, as he looked at Kaneko with hopeful eyes, while her own were conflicted. If she let him stay he would have time to think and maybe find the answer to why Jolina suddenly got mad, which would be great. But it would also mean Jolina would be alone in that big house and would have to do the same, just without people around her to guide her or make her feel calm. But on the other hand, if she said no, Issei would either try and ask someone else to stay at their place, or he would go back home, and with how well he handled it last time, they would probably end up back at square one in a matter of hours. Either way, neither would learn how to deal with this kind of thing correctly. Kaneko sighed deeply, still not seeing how she could make the best decision in this dilemma, where she wouldn't have to step in and help too much, since then they wouldn't learn anything either. Issei. I think that maybe you should try and go back home and talk with her. Kaneko said. She could already see the disagreeing look in Issei's eyes, but before he could get to answer back, she spoke up again. Now, I am not telling you to talk with each other if neither of you are not ready. I am just saying that the way you're trying to handle this right now isn't going to help in the long run. Think about how she is feeling right now. Kaneko asked, feeling bad that she had to play with his kind heart, but how else was she going to win over her little brother's stubbornness? Issei seemed taken aback by what she said, as he hadn't actually thought about what she was feeling at the moment, but he could imagine she was probably just as angry and sad as he was. Just think about it, what you would feel if suddenly she left you all alone in her home after becoming as angry as you did and not giving you a chance to talk. Wouldn't you feel terrible being alone in her home if she had left in a fit of rage too? Kaneko asked, speaking with her own experience on this matter, since she had had this experience before when she and Neen had just begun dating. It had been possibly the worst night in her life, as she could barely make herself do anything other than lay in bed and was waiting for Neen to return home. She could imagine that that was what Jolina was doing at the moment. Just lying there, feeling lost, unsure, angry, sad, bitter and ashamed. Just waiting for Issei to come back so she could tell him how sorry she is. It won't help if you just stay away from her, Lord Issei. It never does. Neen said, finding her own words to add to the ongoing conversation as she too remembered the same night that Kaneko was remembering, though more from Issei's perspective. Sometimes it feels like it will help to get space and it does at first, but too much space can also be bad for you. If you just stay away, it will hurt more as time goes on. Neen continued as she reminisced of her own side of that night. She wanted to help him since he had been a big help in making her able to tell Kaneko her feelings. I think I get it. And you are definitely both right, thank you for guiding me. Again. I'll leave now, since I have probably already overstayed my welcome. Issei said as he stretched the root of his horn a bit nervously, yet he was truly thankful for their wise words. He left not long after, still having hardly eaten anything, but at least he felt a bit more sure of himself. That he might have a chance to fix this between him and her. Haneen went outside with him to see him off and to try and save whatever remains of catnip flowers she could before her mama would burn it all later. Still at the table, though now at each other's side, was Kaneko and Neen, both happy to have been helpful to the young dragon. Though one problem still remained that these two now needed to fix together. Look Kaneko, honey, I am sorry for keeping it secret from you all this time. I wanted to tell you, really I did, but you know how sometimes I worry that Haneen doesn't see me in the same light as she does you, since Neen said, sobbing as she talked, with Kaneko listening carefully to her, understanding what she meant. She put her arms around Neen's torso, pulling her over towards her. I know and I was waiting for you two to tell me. I know how you and Haneen are with each other, but trust me. Just because you believe it doesn't mean it isn't true. Kaneko said as she leaned in towards Neen's forehead and touched it with her own as she hugged her closer into her, breaking the rule she had made only a couple of minutes prior. Neen gave into the hug as well, sobbing even more as she felt dumb for letting her worries get to her like this. Neen couldn't care less if she had been born by me or you, or even have been adopted. She loves us because we are her parents. So stop beating yourself up so much, Neen. You are a wonderful mother, probably better than me sometimes. Kaneko said, feeling a bit bad for her own shortcomings as a parent, though luckily for her Neen was there for her, like she was for her. Rubbish, we are both good parents and even if we might fall short. Then at least we can fall short together, right Shirin? Neen asked, making Kaneko blush a bit at how kind her wife was. Neither noticed their daughter watching them, which is also probably why Kaneko said this so romantically. True. So let's have a few more shortcomings together, Neen. The sounds of happy purrs, sleepy purrs and childhood ruined purrs could all be heard from the happy family of four as the distant sound of wings flapping slowly faded from the area. Another boring, yet regular Wednesday. Meanwhile Tiamat's garden home on the beautifully tiled pathway leading from the main manor of the Garden of Dragons as dubbed by Issei on his 18th birthday to the second home of the Dragon King, Tiamat and the Heavenly Dragon, Issei. The Dragon Queen's Garden. A fitting name given its surroundings, as well as the many different flowers, vines and few trees growing on its walls and edges, which somehow mixed rather well with a blue base and golden design on the walls underneath it. A truly beautiful home, and one rather beloved by its now sole inhabitant, though said inhabitant is not home at the moment. But in his place, someone else, namely Rias Gremory, his older sister, has taken it upon herself to watch his home. She is also there to help Jolina, instead of Grafia who already tried last night, but to practically no avail. She was standing on the last idle design on the pathway, depicting a red dragon flying around a sun in circles. She wore her less formal clothes, that being a simple long-armed blue shirt with a t-shirt underneath since it was a bit cold. A pair of red leggings with a red skirt and some black socks over it. She had her hair down since she felt it wouldn't be needed for her to look too serious, not for now at least. But that would all depend on how hers and Jolina's upcoming conversation was going to go, if it even could go, since from what Rias was told by Grafia, Jolina had been practically unreachable. Besides her mentioning Issei, she was practically deaf to anything else. Rias took a deep breath, shaking her head as a way to get all those doubts out before walking forward and opening the door. As she did that she was met with what she could only describe as one of the most pitiful sights she had ever seen, and she had seen quite a lot of those in her life. At the front door, over in the corner next to a 2-meter tall mirror, sat Jolina all coiled up in a blue blanket, just watching herself in the mirror. Rias didn't know what to do, what to say or how to even start. She was just in shock at how bad Jolina seemed to have it, which only got worse as her eyes began to notice other details. Like her sleep-deprived eyes, both of them having bags underneath. Her hair looked slightly ripped at, like she had ripped out pieces of her hair, but for what? Anger. Frustration. Or self-made punishment. But worse yet was her dull and dead-looking eyes, as if her entire life was over, which in her state of mind it probably was. Though to Rias it just felt a tad bit overdramatic, not that she would comment on it, this was after all, at least from what Rias knew, Jolina's first time arguing with a special friend. And since her brother, Issei, was a bit immature when it came to these things, considering the fact that he would normally have killed the person, it made Rias feel oddly amused by the whole thing. Not that she really was, but it was more a back of the mind kind of thing, since she was still rather worried about Jolina and how she was dealing with all this. Since she herself knew, from first-hand experience, how it feels to have a fight with a lover, though in that case there was a winner, and she paid heavily for that. So with a deep breath and determined look, Rias walked over slowly to Jolina's side, standing a few meters behind her. "Jolina. Can we talk for a bit, you and I?" Rias asked, wanting to check if what Grafia had told her about Jolina being unreachable was still true or not. It was, since even after a solid 20 seconds, she still hadn't given her a repaled, nor had she looked at her via the mirror. "Jolina, I know you can hear me. So please talk to me and let me try to help you." Rias asked in the kindest voice she could muster, mostly as a way to hopefully make Jolina feel more comfortable, though it didn't seem to work the intended way. Since instead of Jolina answering, it was Drake. "Greetings, Rias Gremory. It has been a long time since we last met." Drake spoke, his voice rang deeply in the halls with slight joy, though it was mostly overshadowed by his worry for his host. Rias, upon hearing the ancient dragon's voice, bowed politely, lifting up her skirt and crossing her legs before standing up straight again. "It has, Drake, it truly has. But as much as I would love to talk about old times, I believe I might need your help in this matter, since it seems Jolina has shut herself in." Rias said, sounding happy to hear her old love's best friend again, even though last time hadn't been the best. Though she didn't know if the last time was real, so she had decided not to count it. "Indeed, but I have some bad news on that front," Drake said, as he managed to manifest the boosted gear on Jolina's arm without her even reacting, at least not visible to Rias. "Like I told Grafia last night, there isn't much to be done. She speaks to me, but only through whispers, and her mind is unnaturally stable, which has me quite worried." Drake said, as he repeated the basics of what he told Grafia last night before she left to report to Rias and the rest of the household. Though all of it combined was bad, though some pieces were at least a step in hopefully positive directions, that last one confused Rias. Why would her having a stable mind be concerning? Why would her mind being stable be a problem? If anything, it should be seen as a blessing, since it means. Rias stopped herself as the puzzle pieces put themselves into place, since if Jolina was currently freaking out or acting out of desperation, then she must be in or close to going into that still state she goes into. "Oh, I see, that is quite worrying," Rias said. This newfound worry began to settle in a bit after. "Indeed, which is the way I have been trying to look for. How should I explain it? The root core of the problem," Drake said, almost going into an unneeded rant about how he would describe this problem or what to call how he was finding it. "Anyways, that bit doesn't matter, what really matters is that I am trying to figure out why this happened, but with her not really talking to me and having locked me out of her mind somehow, I am completely at a loss for what to do." Drake finished, revealing to Rias the possible first time, outside of a Juggernaut Drive chant, when one of the twin heavenly dragon souls couldn't communicate properly with their hosts, nor see inside their head. Rias was stunned with this revelation, but still she tried to think of how she should move forward with this new information. "I see, that is really worrisome, but can she still hear me or can she only hear you?" Rias asked, wanting to know if she could even start, even if it was one-sided, a conversation with her. "She can, though her body nor her mind doesn't seem to move, nor react to anything. She reacts whenever someone mentions him, so that might be the best approach, though I wouldn't recommend it since." Drake hesitated a bit as the memory of Jolina's outburst at him rang out inside of his head. "Well, I think Grafia had either been lucky or just didn't pressure her too much about it. Unlike me. Just be warned and do not try or say anything that isn't needed. Remember, she is stronger than you and most of your peerage combined." Drake warned as he went quiet to resume his attempts of opening up Jolina's mind again so that he maybe could figure out why she suddenly attacked Issei verbally yesterday. Rias, who had now been left alone in a sense, still stood a few meters away from Jolina, just watching her reflection in the mirror as she thought over her few, yet hard options. She could simply pressure her into telling her everything, but thanks to Drake's warning, that would probably be as safe as insulting Lilith in front of office. She could also just leave and have the maid keep an eye on her until Issei came home to fix his and Jolina's problem, but knowing her brother, he would probably fumble somewhere along the way and make it worse somehow. So, her only real option was to try and have a girl talk with Jolina right here at the main entrance to the Pyramid Garden home of Issei. She moved over towards Jolina carefully, watching her body for any sudden movement, though there were hardly any to see, besides the routine blinks. She now stood right next to her, with only an arm's length between the two. She sat down on the ground, using her legs as a seat and her skirt as a small pillow between her butt and heels. She hadn't done it on purpose, but she was sitting in a rather Japanese sitting stance. Jolina. Rias, with a slightly unsure voice, began speaking. I hope you understand that Issei has almost jumped to the side as she received a menacing glare from the reflections of Jolina. Her two violet eyes seemed to almost shine with a dark and threatening glow. Though it had shocked her a bit, she took a moment to calm herself before continuing. That he sees you as an important person, despite the things you've said to him. Rias said, before this light of unease began sitting in from unsure she was at how she should continue, though she felt her heart pull her in one direction. And since nothing else seemed to work in her mind right now, then what bad could come from listening to her heart? If you had been anyone else, then Issei wouldn't have kept you alive, nor promised to see you again. That makes you probably as close to him as me, maybe even closer. Rias said, feeling a bit fearful of what she was saying, but since Drake had not chosen to stop her, nor had Jolina done anything either, then maybe what she was doing was working. It was, but not as visible as Rias had hoped for, since she didn't notice the small stares she was getting from Jolina. My brother, ever since I first met him, has always been picky about who he likes. It was by Satan's luck that I ever even managed to earn his forgiveness, and still to this day I fear that the next time I make a mistake he will hate me forever. You see, much like you involved his mother in my own fit of rage or rather desperation. Rias said as she remembered that day through small glints, with the mostly visible parts being the knocked out blue dragon, the hate-filled glare from a young crimson dragon, and her holding onto his cold and almost lifeless body. Jolina saw this in one of her fast stares at her, as her mind and body began being more free, allowing both herself to listen more intently to Rias and Drake to learn what happened yesterday. I know how you feel, well maybe not to the same extent or way, but I understand that feeling all the same. I used to love someone too as well. He was brave, caring, maybe a bit dumb, yet still a wonderful man. My life was perfect, but I chose not to see it because while my life was perfect my love for him wasn't the way I wanted it. Rias said as a small tear rolled down her cheek as she remembered that night faintly. He would always try to help everyone he'd ever met, regardless if they were friend or foe. He became so popular that I started to feel forgotten thanks to the many women swarming around him, like moths to a flame. A flame that I felt was mine and mine alone. So one night I confronted him about it, much in the same way that you did. Rias said as the night replayed itself in her mind, with the sight of her looking down at the armored figure of Issei Haidu, trying to hide his tears so as to not give Rias more things to insult him with. I let my emotions get the better of me and it led to Issei fighting back when I went too far. I said something to him that I never should have, but at the time I thought little of it since I was so self-centered that I didn't realize that even to that day he was still haunted by it. Rias said, before she reached up with her left hand and wiped a small tear away, before she chuckled sadly at how stupid she had been on repeat when it came to that one issue. I told, well rather screamed at his face that what Rainer had done had been a blessing in disguise. He almost broke my back as payback to my insult, leaving me with a pretty nasty scar. Rias said, as she pointed at her back with little effort. Jolina was genuinely shocked to hear that the former Red Dragon Emperor had done something like that to the person he loved, but then again she couldn't really defend him, since she might have done the same. But that's just the price of bucking up. It leaves scars, both physical and also mental. Neither is good, but they still teach you and your partner something valuable about each other. Rias said as she started feeling weirdly confident after revealing that secret to Jolina, and now she just, rather couldn't wait to say her next golden nugget of wisdom. She felt a bit childish about it, but she could see that Jolina had begun reacting more to her talking. And what helped that belief more was when this happened. What does it teach me about Issei? Jolina asked nervously, feeling unsure of herself. It didn't help that her voice was weak from both her lack of sleep, eating and other basic needs that she had denied for her self-made punishment. Rias smiled warmly at her, still through the mirror as the two had gained eye contact. That if you need to go that far for them, or for them to go so far to make you angry or sad, then you and them have a bond strong enough to endure through it. Rias said, though it left both her and Jolina a bit confused at her supposed wisdom. What Jolina asked, with Drake silently asking the same, as Jolina finally turned her head towards Rias, who was sweating a bit at her poorly explained words. Well you see. What I mean is that you two will figure it out right, he. Sorry. Rias said as her former happy and confident attitude was gone and replaced with more of a nervous stuttering mess. Though it may not have brought the original intended effect, it still made Rias able to talk face to face with Jolina. Who, even though she was more confused at whatever Rias was trying to say, still seemed less depressed and pitiful than before. I don't really know what I am saying anymore. But I think I was trying to tell you that everything will work out. Some things will never be the same while new things become available. You just have to choose, with Issei by your side, how you two will handle these changes. Rias said, as she somehow saved her previous statement with one that made sense in some capacity. Jolina turned away from Rias as she began to stare at herself in the mirror again, though she didn't look sad or depressed. She looked like she was deep in thought. Rias sighed with great relief as she felt this sudden feeling of pressure leaving her shoulders coming over her. It was almost too much when she felt how much it was. Geez, these two are too much alike. Both overly Rias' thoughts were stopped as both she and Jolina suddenly stood up as they felt themselves being teleported into a pocket dimension. Rias wasn't too worried about the sudden shift in her current dimensional plane, she was mostly worried about why they had suddenly been put in there. Jolina on the other hand though, was quite spooked since this was her first time going into one. She had traveled across dimensions and realms many times, but she had never gone into one of these before. Ah. What's going on, she asked very worriedly as she looked all around her and began noticing something strange. The whole dimension was literally just Issei's home, though she noticed that she and Rias were probably at the edge of it. Seeing as when she looked down the main hallway where the stairs leading should have been, instead now was a hole into some freaky light show. But when she turned towards Rias, she stopped right before she could fully see the back of Rias' head as her eyes suddenly became blindly by a bright shining light. She blinked a few times, even putting up her hand to cover her eyes, which gave her a view of where the light was coming from. Where the left side of the giant double door should have been, now instead was a massive hole, allowing for a clear sight of the now withered and burnt down garden, which could be seen along with many cracks in both the floor and walls. But even more striking than that was the giant crimson figure hovering over a much smaller, yet weirdly to Jolina's innate combat mind, more fighting white-haired figure holding a sword. She knew at a glance who the crimson figure was, thanks to both his magical signature, plus him having shown off his body a few times in the past week. It was Issei. Issei. She said weakly, before taking a slow and unsteady step forward. You came. Rias shut up her arm to prevent Jolina from going any further, since it was clear, to Rias at least, that Jolina couldn't feel the intense heat Issei was giving off. Don't go any closer. It's not safe right now. Rias said, as she struggled with setting up both a protective and heat-resistant barrier around the two. If you go any closer, you will be roasted alive. Issei isn't bucking around like when you and him first met. He is serious this time. Rias said as she finished the preparations of the barriers and began forming a rather thin dome around them before she began to instead focus both her magic on hers and Jolina's barrier, along with the whole area, as to not unleash Issei's insane heat. Jolina was still trying to process everything that was happening, with her beginning to plan how she and Issei were going to deal with their problem, until now, since he was suddenly here and seemed to be about to fight that white-haired figure. She still, even after Ria's warning reached her hand out towards him, she wanted to talk to him. To hold him again. And to apologize. Rias didn't see Jolina's hand nearing the walls of the barrier, nor when she breached it, but she did hear Jolina's slight scream of pain. Jolina. I told you not to. Oh dear. Buck. Rias didn't know what to do. Jolina's entire right hand had been burned, with some of her arm having burn marks too. It wasn't irreversible damage, but it was still bad. Thankfully Jolina had a pretty huge pain tolerance, and just to be safe, she summoned the boosted gear to boost it. Boost. Jolina still clenched her right hand in her now armored left one, feeling the Buck. She yelled before she fell down on her knees, still holding her burnt hand protectively. What did you call her? Issei roared out across the small pocket dimension, making the two women put their attention onto him and the white-haired figure, who seemed to have sprouted dark feather wings and was currently flying in front of Issei. I called her a whore, my boy, because only a whore would have given birth to someone. Issei didn't even let him finish before he was suddenly swatted away by his left claw before being slammed into the ground by his massive tail. A massive cloud of dust was sent up into the sky as a result of Issei's raw strength, but said cloud shot out a small stream of itself before it too broke, revealing the white-haired man was fine and had his sword in a slashing ready position. Die, you face dragon, die, bastard son of Tiamat, the man screamed as he practically nose-dived right at Issei, thanks to how high up he had flown with his wings, so that even despite Issei standing at 50 meters tall, he could still gather enough momentum to perform as fast an attack as this. Issei didn't have a chance to defend himself, so before he knew it the man had slashed along, but thankfully swallow cut on the right side of his neck. Bastard, Issei roared out in pain before slashing out after him with his front legs, but it only served to let his opponent get another attack in on him. This time on his right front leg, making Issei have to bend said leg by just the sheer amount of pain it caused him. You don't deserve the title of a heavenly dragon, only Lord Crom did now die, the man yelled before he suddenly spread out his dark wings and flew up as high as he could before positioning his sword right over his head. He then began to dive straight at Issei, at speeds Issei couldn't for unknown reason see himself dodging. He just stood there as his opponent came straight at him from above. He could only increase his defense at this point and hope it would save him. Jolina saw all this in slow motion as the crimson and now slightly burning giant figure of Issei was looking up at the quickly descending white light coming down towards him, ready to end him. Without any care for herself, but only for him she ran. Issei. Chapter 6. An old enemy rises. Issei, Jolina cried as she exited the barrier once more, feeling the intense heat burning her body, but not for long as Drake activated the Welsh Dragon chainmail. It boosted her body's resistance towards the heat, allowing for her to fly towards the two figures at high speeds, thanks to her own pair of wings, namely the wings of the chainmail armor set. Issei, upon hearing Jolina's voice, lost his focus, making him stop his increase in power for but a moment before regaining his focus and continuing his power up. The wave of heat was sent out all around him, with him being its source. It made both the white-haired man and Jolina have to put their arms up to protect themselves from the strength behind the wave. It was strong enough to make the white-haired man be sent flying back, while it only made Jolina have to dig her feet into the withered and burnt ground as she kept boosting her fire resistance and slight healing ability. "Jolina. Leave and take my sister with you," Issei said stoically, though thanks to his current form, it sounded more like he was angry. He somewhat painfully turned his gaze away from Jolina and Ria's direction as he focused more on his opponent. "And you. You must pay for your transgression against my mother," minor son Issei roared out, making both the heat and Ria's fear even more intense. Rias knew most, if not all of Issei's spells and abilities, and she knew that luckily Minor's son wasn't that bad compared to some of the other things he could do, but it could still easily break this dimensional pocket if he didn't focus its power properly. Right over Issei's head a small golden orb began to form, with it gaining more power and a more mixed match of flame-like colors as speck of mana Issei sense wave fused into it. Rias was hoping that Jolina would notice how dangerous that orb could be just by how hot it had become by its mere presence, but unfortunately Jolina kept pushing through as she took a huge and deep step for a second that passed, with her armor tip slightly melting before being repaired. It just went to show that among fire dragons, Issei was the apex if even the armor made of a heavenly dragon, who himself was a fire dragon, could melt by just one of Issei's weakest abilities. "Jolina, come back to the barrier right now, you won't be able to survive, no matter how many times you boost," Rias shouted, hoping she could make Jolina retreat back into her barrier so they could make it strong enough and also keep the dimensional pocket going so the real world wouldn't be put into a heat wave unlike any it had ever seen. But instead, Jolina decided to try and fly towards the white-haired man, who still hadn't paid them any attention, as his focus was solely on the small sun being created right above Issei, who was glaring daggers at him, even more so his black feathery wings. "Come on Drake, boost my wings as much as you can. I need to help him," Jolina shouted through the mental connection to Drake, who too also wanted Jolina to retreat, but seeing as how practically none of his host ever did as he wanted, he resigned himself to boosting her wings and fire resistance as much as he could. "You better not make me regret this," Drake roared inside Jolina's head, both angry yet proud by her actions. No real dragon could ever look down on one of their kind trying to help the ones they love. Jolina flying sped to levels she hadn't really practiced much with, making her almost fly into Issei himself, but luckily she dodged in the last second, but earned both the attention of Issei and the white fallen angel. The white hair man noticed the figure of the armor before smiling a wicked smile as he suddenly nose-dived after her, without Issei noticing. Jolina tried to steer herself around toward Issei again, this time at less intense speeds, which she managed as she flew over next to his head, not feeling the Minotaur's sun, as she was more focused on Issei. "Issei. Let me help, I can fight him too, I am strong enough," Jolina said, showing off her aura, hoping she could get Issei's approval, though regardless she would help either way. "You're no match for this man, so just run." Jolina dodged just in the last second, as Issei's angry voice calmed itself, it switched to immediate worry as the white-haired man appeared right above Jolina. His sword was pointed straight at Jolina's beautiful face, ignorant of what kind of danger she was in, so Issei chose to take the hit on her behalf. While Issei in what Jolina could only describe as her life flashing right before her eyes, as the sword the man was using cut right through Issei's left hand's middle claw, severing the last joint and claw from the main hand. It left the entire area silent until possibly the loudest roar or maybe even whimper could be heard by Issei himself at the intense pain the sword had afflicted him with. "Ahhhh, you bastard, I will kill you," Issei roared as he let his anger out, letting go of Jolina intentionally, and began to spew golden and orange flames out at the man in a vain and rage-induced attempt to simply kill him. Jolina managed to grape onto the side of Issei's left front leg, hanging on with all her might as Issei kept moving around, even as he took off from the ground below with his wings, making an enormous cloud of dust be pushed out from his original position on the ground. Sun said, he roared as he finally cut the magic circle he had to the small that had still been over his head, letting it float by itself and remaining stationary. With that severing from Issei, it began to shine even more brightly, making the already orangish sky color turn to a much darker orange, with small mixes of red and yellow in it, like the sky itself had become a sun. It wasn't though, thankfully, it was just a show of how much magic he had concentrated into that small orb, since it was now beginning to penetrate this small pocket dimension. What's got you so riled up? It's just one finger, the white-haired man mocked him, as he kept dodging Issei with his own much more refined moves, while Issei tried his best with his less controlled and more volatile ones. He was destroying the ground under him, as each mist hit or wave of fire he spewed out would either make small meteor-sized craters or burn whatever plant life was still alive. It was like a sea of flames below him, with only Ria's little barrier being still relatively safe and unharmed. And while Issei was using his godlike strength in his attempt to kill this unknown enemy, Jolina was barely hanging onto his leg before letting go and flying onto his back and grabbing onto one of the small stubbly spikes going down his back. She was thankful for the sharp and durable golden claws the boost gear armor had, but it was still barely enough to keep her hanging. She had to use every ounce of strength in her fingers just to dig the claws in deep enough as to not make her fall off at the slightest motion from Issei. Issei, calm down, don't just attack HMP. Don't attack him randomly, be smart about it, she shouted as best she could, since the contest wind and fast pulls of force were really draining on her, but it seemed to have worked as Issei began to slow down. Buck me, it worked, Hiaktu. No, it didn't work. Issei had just slowed down for a bit so that he could focus his fire breath more accurately. But it seems like he got tired of that idea as he suddenly sped up again, throwing his giant claws around again, even adding his tail for that extra range. Jolina didn't try to say anything as it happened, as she was way more focused on holding the continuously moving back of Issei, not to mention not trying to melt alive, thanks to just how hot Issei. Oi, come on and try a little, you dipshit, I thought you were supposed to be strong or something. What the hell is this weak ass excuse of a showcase of those heavenly powers? You shut it, brat, let the sun judge you as I have. Issei interrupted the man, making him slightly annoyed before he became confused at his words. Jolina was also confused as to what he meant by let the sun judge you, but only one other person, besides Issei himself, knew what that meant. You cursed little brat, making that girl worry about you. She angrily said, before sighing and making a rather underprepared teleportation circle under Jolina, bringing her back inside the little barrier Rias had made. Wait. But Rias, what did you? There's no time for that, start pouring your magic into the barrier right now, Rias ordered, not showing how tired she had become after doing that last spell. Jolina didn't argue with her, mostly for the fact that she could guess if she had teleported her, then it meant whatever Issei had just said meant something for them all, but it didn't keep her from being a bit angry that she had been pulled away from Issei. But she could still see him even from here, and thanks to this new point of view she had gotten, after having sat on his back for the last 2 minutes or so, gave her a full view of his rather calm face. He didn't look like he was in pain at all, not anymore. No, he looked like he was about to do something he had been looking forward to for quite some time. Even the white-haired man noticed this and was verbally angry about Issei's lack of rage-induced roars and whimpers. What the buck are you on about now? Let the sun judge me. I don't give a damn, I am gonna kill you, and then I will kill every last person that the white-haired man stopped himself as his body suddenly began to violently shake, with him screaming out in pure pain. Then his body began to darken as his white skin began to tan itself before turning to roast. Then flames began appearing from his mouth, eyes, ears and nose. It was like a fire had been set ablaze inside of him, and now it was coming out much more violently than originally planned. Jolina watched in horror at what she would think was Issei's doing, as she couldn't really think of anyone else here who could do such a thing. It made her neck hair straighten out and her inner instinct scream at her to run away, telling her that he was a monster of unprecedented power that shouldn't be trifled with. She looked towards her still burned hand and watched it closely, as if seeing it like an early warning of how intense Issei heat could be. Rias noticed her deep look. She had been like this once as well, when she first saw him using this weak power of his on his foes. It would usually always go the same, him acting like an unrefined beast, then preparing the spell before he finally dropped the ficard and burnt his foe alive from the inside. The sun has judged you, may your ashes be used for something good for the coming years. Mercenary of Apollo. Issei said angrily as he watched the man still burning alive, with his wings now too being engulfed in flames, making him unwillingly descend towards the sea of flames below. Damn you bastard son of Tiamat. The man's last words weren't of anything noteworthy, but even so his death had been, from the perspective of Jolina at least, a needlessly cruel one. Even if he had attacked and done permanent damage to Issei, this had still been overkill in her opinion, plus wouldn't it have been smarter to keep them alive to find out why he had attacked him? Not that there was any time to think about that for too long, as soon after the white-haired man's now dead and burnt body hit the ground, a strong orange light began to engulf the entire space around them. Jolina felt the rough and destroyed ground under her be replaced with fine and smoothly carved marble that she and Rias had sat on moments before the sudden shift in dimensions that Issei had made to keep his and his opponent's fight from destroying his and his family's home. The two women were now back on the floor where they had been before the fight had begun, with them both in the exact same positions as before. Jolina looked around the room, trying to make sure it was all like it had been before. She found no missing pieces of the room, nor any broken furniture or walls like in that other dimension. It made Rias smile quite joyously at how cute Jolina was reacting to this whole thing, since it was obvious that this was her first time in a pocket dimension. She couldn't deny she hadn't done the same for her first time either. But this wasn't the time for her to enjoy Jolina's amazed expression of how everything was now back to how it used to be, since she needed to find Issei quickly and get Asia to heal him. "Jolina, let's go find Issei, we need to find that idiot and get Asia to heal him," Rias said jokingly as she reached out her hand and waited for Jolina to put her own hand in hers. Jolina was a bit nervous about it since her mind had now gotten a chance to calm down, which had made her realize how close she and Issei had been earlier, not to mention how thoughtless she had been in her actions. Even if she had done it all to save or at least help Issei, she couldn't help but worry if he saw her differently because of that. But even so, she was determined to see him and talk about last night's events with him in full and hopefully make up so that they could keep being around each other. And maybe one day be with each other, but that was something she would have to worry about later. "Right, let's go, Rias," Jolina said, her much more happy smile appearing on her face as she grabbed Ria's hand with her own slightly bigger hand. Rias almost fell over just from the force of Jolina hanging on to her, making her wonder how heavy Jolina was. As soon as Jolina was off the floor, standing on her 2 feet and ready to go find Issei, but before the two could reach the door it was opened up from the outside as Issei stepped in through it and panted heavily. It took a second for the two to come over their surprise at him already being here, as they then noticed the 2 wounds on his body, one on his neck from the second hit and the most obvious, one on his right arm, though luckily it seemed to have stopped bleeding. And then his now middle fingerless left hand, which he had clenched around his severed finger. He looked at them, his eyes feeling dazed as he didn't seem to be able to fully focus on them, before they suddenly seemed to be able to recognize them, leading to him smiling faintly before dropping down on one knee. He let go of his severed finger and used his left hand to put pressure on his slightly open neck. The bleeding wasn't lethal, but it was still painful and needed to be closed soon, or else it would probably get infected. "Issei," the two yelled as they ran over to him, and with Jolina scanning his body for any more wounds, while Rias used what little healing magic she had to close his neck together. "Hey. Hey, I am fine. Don't worry too much, just call big sis Asia," and it had been broken near the head, so it wasn't so noticeable, but it had still managed to stay inside his leg. It surprised her how he was fine with an arrow inside of his leg, but getting cut a few places was making him fall slowly unconscious. Luckily to inform her of her wrong idea of what Issei had been cut by, Drake began speaking to her inside her head. "Jolina, I do not believe Issei was cut by any normal weapon, nor is this arrow normal either. It reeks of Dragon Slayer magic," Drake said in a serious tone as he kept sensing for what kind or rather which sort had inflicted these attacks, since depending on the weapon the damage could drastically vary. Jolina was confused by his words since she had never seen or really experienced dragon slaying magic before, though she had heard of it briefly from her uncle and Drake a few times. Dragon Slayer magic? Does that have something to do with why Issei is like he is right now? Jolina asked out loud, gaining the attention of Rias, who became shocked at first before noticing the rather familiar magical feeling coming from Issei's wounds. She had spent a little over a decade with a dragon-slaying sword around her nearly all the time, so it had become a weirdly normal feeling for her, so she hadn't noticed it until now that Jolina had mentioned it. "Yes, I believe so. Dragon-slaying weapons can have widely different effects on dragons, with the most common one being death, though that is only after the dragon has sustained a sufficient amount of damage. Other things can be like leaving them in a weakened state or permanently locking away some of their powers," Drake said, his worry being obvious to the two women, but his explanation was still what they mainly paid attention to. Issei began to cough a bit before it suddenly turned violent. Jolina and Rias noticed and tried to help him by lifting up a piece of cloth from Jolina's pockets and holding it over his mouth and letting him cough into it. "Issei, are you okay?" "Oh my god, Issei, you're bleeding," Jolina shouted after she took away her small piece of cloth, revealing the small stain of crimson red blood on it, freshly coughed up from Issei's wounded throat. He looked surprised at the cloth before he himself noticed the rather irony taste in his mouth, licking it away from his lips and teeth. Rias quickly made a communication circle, calling Asia over as fast as she could. Meanwhile, Jolina brought Issei into the living room and put him on the sofa to rest and to keep him from using too much energy. He fell onto the sofa with a heavy thud before lying into it and releasing a breath of relief before letting a slow and awkward silence consume the two. Neither said a word, nor did they share a single glance, as Jolina had chosen subconsciously to sit at the edge of the sofa, next to his wounded leg. But Issei looked at her, or rather her back. He noticed her unclean hair, how its long and former silky-like nature had faded and instead had become a mess. He noticed her slumped shoulders, and he heard her worried heartbeat as it beat fast and loud enough for him to hear it. He could even feel how cold her body was, thanks to his right leg being next to her left leg. It made him feel guilty, since she wouldn't have been like this if he hadn't decided to run away last night, instead of just talking it over. She obviously cared a lot about him, and he had known that from day one he met her, so having him react like he did when she became angry or overly selfish in her plans had probably hurt her a lot. He can't and shouldn't say he shouldn't have reacted the way he did because she had been unreasonable in a few of the situations, but he should have tried to stay calm and talk it over with her. Kaneko. You were right. Like always. I'll try my best to fix this, but when? No, not when, but how? What would be the best way to do this? Issei thought to himself as he kept watching Jolina, feeling her awkward and shy mood keep growing as she kept holding herself back thanks to her own guilt. Joe, he is over there, come one hurry, Asia. Rias interrupted as she shut the doors open and brought in a worried Asia. Asia was barely dressed in proper attire as she came running over in her night clothes with her twilight healing rings already out and ready. She rushed right over and past Jolina, who just stood up and walked over to Rias, still not looking at Issei directly, while Asia began to scan Issei's body for every wound and scratch. What did you do this time, Issei? Who hurt you? Asia asked worriedly, making Issei chuckle a bit as he found her worry somewhat adorable, as he himself thought little of it since it didn't hurt much. I am fine, Asia. Just got attacked by some dumb mercenary who happened to wield a dragon-slaying sword. I am fine, I just wanted. Asia poked the wound on his neck while giving him a stern glare as she reacted to his slight whimper at the sudden pain. You said? She asked as she began to reach out with her hands, ready to heal his body. Fine, it hurts like hell, sis. Please heal me, Asia Wani-chan. Issei said as his true feelings came out, or at least his more overdramatic ones. It somewhat confused Jolina, or it would have if she wasn't focusing on something else at the moment. Since Issei is who he is unfortunately rather hated by a pretty important group of beings, and sometimes these beings send prideful humans or stupid demigods his way to try and kill him, but it only ever really ends with them losing money, as Issei normally kills or captures the hitmen sent his way. So because of this rather normal occurrence, Asia hadn't gotten used to see him hurt like this, sometimes even worse, but mostly he only ever gets hit once or twice. So the two had a kind of weird sarcastic play they performed each time he got into one of these fights, though this time Asia could hear it in his voice that he was being serious. He hadn't been attacked by a dragon slayer before, only people who just had a ton of magic reserves or demigods of war gods, so this time was more painful, even if it was considered by their shared experience as a normal fight. Asia immediately noticed the dragon-slaying magic that had been imbued into his body through his many wounds. She could even feel his pain tolerance working overtime, thanks to how much pain he should be in right now. It was a dragon slayer who did this, right? Asia asked as she began to cast a high-tier healing spell on Issei, with him nodding with a painful grunt at the end. She just sighed worriedly, since she had always feared the day where those who seek to kill Issei would send a dragon slayer, and it seems today was that day. Those damn. I can't believe I once thought all gods were kind beings. Yet to think one could be so cruel as to send. It's okay, Asia, I survived after all, right? Issei said, interrupting her as he put his right hand on her left arm as he smiled kindly at her. She just pouted as she cast the spell, making Issei suddenly feel a soothing relief as his pain began to fade. But the former pain had only just faded before his right ear was being yanked by Asia as she looked at him with an angry pout and began speaking. You might have survived this time, Issei, but don't think that just because you can survive once means you can do it the next time. I will still heal you, but even I can't. Sob. I can't heal you. If you're. Asia stopped herself as her fear of this horrible what-if scenario began to play out in her mind. A few tears began to run down her pearly white cheeks and her green eyes began to become cloudy as her eyes were filled with tears. Issei felt bad for how worried he had made her and how insensitive he had been with what he had said before. She had a point, even if it hadn't been said out verbally to the extent she might have wanted to, and that was she couldn't save, heal or do anything for him if he was already dead. He could save once, but could he also survive a second or third time? I am sorry, Asia, I will try to be careful from now on, okay? Issei said as he sat up with a bit of struggle and hugged her from a sitting position. She kept crying on his golden hair, with it sizzling out shortly after it touched his hair. They stayed like that for a bit, with Rias and Jolina just standing on the sideline, as each was focusing on something completely different from the other, before Asia and Issei let go and left Asia to return back to the main mansion. Rias and Jolina followed her out, as Issei still needed to lie down for a bit longer. Jolina and Rias split up a bit after Asia left, as Rias needed to talk with Issei about something important, and she could tell that right now Jolina wasn't really focused enough to talk with Issei. Small time skip. Jolina had chosen to wander around the mansion after her, and Rias had said goodbye to Asia together. So while she did that, Rias had gone back to talk with Issei. As she entered the living room, she looked over to where Issei had last been, but to her surprise he was gone. Though it didn't take her long before she noticed the rather clear and unfortunate trail of slightly dried blood on the ground, leading from the sofa to his trophy room. The name of the room was rather obvious, but if someone was confused about its name, then Issei had put up a sign with it on. But it was in Draconic, so basically no one but devils and dragons could read it. She began to walk over to the door, noticing it too had been left slightly open, making her even more confident that Issei was inside doing something. But what? Issei, are you there? She called out as she reached the door and opened it, hearing a few footsteps from inside, before hearing his voice calling back. Yep, what do you need? He asked, so uncaringly like he hadn't just been cut up, healed and seen his older sister cry her eyes out, afraid of him dying in the near future. Rias entered the room, noticing two things as the room came into view. One was Issei walking around the room, checking out all the different scrolls of silk and fine cloth. And the other was the viciously ripped and teared up scroll lying on the ground. Why is one of your banners on? Because the bastard owns me a finger, and now he also owes me a new banner, since it looks like he got his bucking uncle to send a reaper here and break into my house. Issei said, with only a slight irritation in his voice. He was still checking if anything else had been destroyed or was missing, since he didn't feel it was necessary to get angry over just one thing being destroyed. I see, so it really was Apollo who sent him. Rias said, as she moved over to his side and began helping him search for other ones that had been destroyed, with them working almost perfectly intact. Yep, arrogant bastard just won't give up. But worst yet, he even brings in his family just to threaten me. Issei said as he looked at another scroll carefully, trying to find even the slightest tear or missing piece of cloth or silk. Issei, you need to do something, and no, Rias pointed her pointy finger at him, stopping him from saying what he was about to say. Just attacking him and beating him up publicly won't solve it this time. Issei grunted with annoyance, believing his plan to be superior, but he wasn't against listening to her sister. So what do you propose? That I just go up to old Peas and ask dear old rapist Zeus if he could make his bastard son stop sending hitmen after me? Issei asked, his anger and disdain for his proposed idea was clear to Rias, which only made it harder for her, since that had been her plan. She sighed lightly, before moving to the left and beginning to look through the next row, with Issei following after her. Well, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to try. And if that doesn't work, you could always. Rias stopped herself, knowing well that he wouldn't agree to it, at least not under normal circumstances. Issei looked over at her, his golden eyes trying to read her own ocean blue for any sign of what she was talking about. He was less interested in her plan of trying to talk with Zeus, as his curiosity for whatever else she was trying to recommend had made him more interested. I could always what? What can I do besides beating Apollo to a pulp? Issei asked, his curiosity and annoyance from the whole situation mixing together in his tone, making him sound rather angry. Rias stopped looking at the scrolls and turned towards Issei. Her eyes filled with a mix of determination and also worry at how he would react to her suggestion. What if you join a faction? Issei immediately walked away from her and began walking over towards the door, with Rias following right after him. I know you don't like the idea, but you need to have people behind you, a faction or group. Rias said, feeling slightly angry as Issei still kept walking towards the door to the living room, still not answering her. She grabbed his left hand, noticing his middle finger had been put back, and yanked him around towards her. Issei, look at me when I am talking to you. Issei was shocked at her suddenly raising her voice, with even herself being surprised for a moment before calming herself and talking normally again. You need people, Issei. You need to join some faction or group that can help you when these things happen. After all, you can't join us anymore. Rias said, her head hanging low as she remembered that day, before raising her head again and making eye contact with Issei. He still didn't say anything back, he just kept quiet and listened. If you can't do it because of your pride, then do it for her. Issei was confused for a moment about what she meant by her until it hit him and instead made him feel angry. Angry that she was trying to make him do something he didn't want to and that she was using her as a kind of blackmail. Rias, don't you dare try to blackmail me with her. You should know better than anyone else. A sudden thump was heard from outside of the door, interrupting the two from their conversations, as they both used their magic sense to figure out who it was on the other side. The two both looked surprised at each other, as they knew the signature rather well, mostly Issei since he had been living with her for the last few days. The two moved over to the door, opened it up and found Jolina lying on the ground, ripping her head, where a newly made blue mark had appeared. It was rather clear to the sibling pair that Jolina had fallen over and landed on her head. But why had she fallen over? Jolina, are you okay? Issei asked as he tried his best to hide his previous anger in order to appear happy or less worried than he probably should be right now. He went down on one knee and reached out with his right hand to her. She hadn't fully proceeded what Issei had said or done, as her head was still ringing a bit, but she grabbed onto his hand still, but more as a reflex, and with his help stood up again. Yeah, I am fine, just didn't think blood was so slippery, but are you two okay? You two seem to have been arguing, based on how Rias was shouting at you earlier. Jolina asked, her somewhat daisy head having disabled her filter, plus also slightly numbed her nerves, not making her realize she was still holding onto Issei's hand. Issei and Rias both felt a bit embarrassed at them being found arguing with each other, but both shrugged it off. Rias was ready to step up and explain, but was interrupted by Issei as he took charge instead. Oh, it wasn't anything important, just some possible solutions to my problem with a certain sunburned idiot. That's all, and I guess I was just being a bit too stubborn since Rias had to raise her voice. Issei said in a chipper tone, as he acted a bit happier than earlier, not wanting Jolina to be involved in his problem. He hadn't noticed either that they were still holding hands, not yet at least. Jolina just nodded, understanding what he had said. Issei. Don't try to keep her out of this. Rias said, earning herself a confused look from Jolina and a disagreeing one from Issei. Is it so bad to not want her involved in this? Issei asked as he and Rias began to have a semi-stare down with each other, as each had their own idea of what Jolina needed and didn't need to know. No, it isn't. But keeping her completely in the dark isn't much better, and besides if a Reaper really was here, then they already know about her. Rias said, raising an important point that Issei hadn't really thought about before, since the last hour or so had been pretty jammed-packed with different things. But even so, this didn't do much to change his opinion on the matter. They wouldn't dare, not while she is here, and not as long as she's the Red Dragon Emperor. Issei said as he put his face right up in front of Rias, making her have a full view of his now slitted eyes, signaling that he wasn't in the mood to argue about this, nor the previous matter they had been discussing. Rias just sighed heavily, before looking away and waving her hand dismissively at him. Fine, then you will deal with this yourself, I have already done all I can to help you. Rias said, her voice sounding angry at first, before the fire in it faded slightly, leaving a more sad and worried voice behind. It made Issei feel bad, but even so his pride couldn't let him back down from his decision. He turned away from her and began to walk away, still holding Jolina in his hand, making him drag her away. Jolina was still mainly confused as to what the two had been talking about, since it didn't make much sense to her, with all those new words they used, plus that she hadn't heard how their previous conversation had started. So basically, she had no real clue or idea at what the two had really been discussing. The only thing she did know was that Issei didn't want her involved. Be it to simply protect her or to keep a kind of distance between them. She didn't know. The two kept walking down the long halls, with Issei walking fast and making Jolina have to slightly jog just to keep up with him. The whole house was in total silence, with the only sound being their footsteps and sound of Rias teleporting back home. They went up the stairs, with Issei slightly yanked at Jolina's arm every other step, though, thanks to their slightly different physica, Jolina didn't stumble or get suddenly pulled off her feet, as her arm's length was great enough for her to simply stretch it a bit every time he would pull on it. Issei dragged them through the second floor and over to his and hers room, opening the doors forcefully. He let go of Jolina's hand and kept walking over towards the bed, before sitting himself down on it, then lying down on his back and watching the unlit lamp hanging in the ceiling quietly. Jolina, meanwhile, just stood quietly in the doorframe, unsure of what she was supposed to do in this situation. Should she go over and lie down next to him? Should she try to talk with him? Or should she just keep quiet and stay here until he calls for her? She wanted to talk with him, to help him since he was clearly upset with what Rias had said, but she didn't know if that was what he wanted her to do, or if she even had any right to involve herself in this. Maybe he doesn't want me to be so close with him, not like before. Jolina wondered in her unsure worry, as this, like many of the things she had experienced in the past week or two, were all rather new to her. She had no prior experience with any of this, only ideas and vague tips that she didn't feel were appropriate at the moment. Though it wasn't just her who was unsure and new to all of this, since Issei was also worried about these things and confused on what to do now. That was part of the reason why he had chosen to lie on the bed, quietly and silently, waiting for her himself to do something. Maybe she doesn't trust like she did before. I wouldn't blame her if she did. Issei thought as a wave of shame began to gnaw at him, both for getting overly angry at Rias, but also for being unable to say what he knew he needed to say, but instead always ended up hiding behind his proud farce and choosing a much more aggressive option. If only someone could help me, they both thought, as each of them continued to let the silence encapsulate them, making each of them feel less and less able to speak as each second passed by them. Until Jolina Issei, they each felt surprised as they each had tried to speak, only ending with them interrupting each other. Issei turned his head towards her, his golden eyes widened at the sight of her. He felt her current posture to be soft, gentle, sad, shy, yet beautiful in the end. Her head was slightly hanging, hiding both parts of her face and her violet eyes, as her long blue hair covered most of her face's right side. Some of it even went over her naked shoulders in both ways, leaving its edger end clearly visible. Her used and stained clothes, despite their appearance, made her look pretty. And her posture was making him unable to move his eyes away from her as she unknowingly showed skin in many areas, along with the sunlight from the hall window outside the door, shining in on her from behind, making her look almost godly. Beautiful. He said softly, as his rational self had stopped working, as it couldn't keep him from spitting out random words of affection or appreciation of the beauty Jolina held in his eyes. Jolina became confused for a moment before a small tint of red could be seen on her cheeks as she realized that he said she was beautiful. Thank you. She spoke shyly, putting up her hands to hide her slowly increasing blush while opening small peek holes for her eyes to watch him, who now had his eyes looking directly at hers. He gulped nervously as what he had just said to her dawned on him. He too gained a small blush on his cheeks, yet he didn't hide it. You're welcome, Jolina. Underworld, realm of Hades, main castle. Deep below, in the most ancient parts of the underworld, lies the original kingdom of the dead, Hades. Its famous red river of Styxes, full of death and unhappiness, flowed through this kingdom as its main water source, along with its main and most used traveling path, as a being who too was old beyond memory of some of the oldest gods and beings to live, resided in his small yet sturdy little boat. He rowed up and down the river each hour, of each day, of each year. Along the river banks lie many bones, weapons and artifacts from many millions of heroes and brave people throughout history, who had come to a cruel and inevitable end on the field of battle. They made up most of the building materials for this realm, as they could be used to build many kinds of strutacs, like the great and lumbering castle in which the lord and ruler of this realm and his wife lived in. It had many grand towers of bone and sword, even some of decayed souls and false gods, but its most impressive part was that of its main castle. The shining light of which every dead soul must follow when entering this kingdom. It was a giant stone, or rather a giant mix of many precious stones that had all been put together and magic imbued to guide every dead being to their new home, be it in Hades or its basement kingdom of Tartarus. And inside this eye-catching castle, two beings sat together, each of almost equal standing and power. On one throne they sat, showing not only their lack of restraint for their love of each other, but also their neat and great partnership that they had made together, beating every other marriage in their entire faction. The one on top was a beautiful-looking woman who looked perhaps to be in her early 30s, when it was probably more likely she was in her late 8000s. She wore a long, sleeveless and pink-dyed dress, with small accents of black and darker purple on it, to match with her husband and kingdom better. Her long blonde hair flowed down the side of her torso, with her husband stroking through it like he was her hair comb, which in some cases he probably was. He too had quite the young look to him, despite his actual age being up there along with his wife's, but even so he looked no older than 40. He had a short and stubby white beard, with short white hair to match it with. One of his eyes was missing, and in its place a single ruby had been put in instead. He wore dress-like attire with shades of blue and dark blue. These two were the rulers of this place, and were much in love, as neither Persephone nor Hades noticed the small reaper trying to get their attention, as they were too focused on each other. My lord Hades, you really must tell me one of these days when I can expect to see our dear little pet again. I have missed his presence for the last few years. Persephone said, as she began to curl her long hair around with her right hand, while gently holding the other on her husband's thin, yet strong chest. He chuckled lightly as he calmed his fast strokes into a more slow, yet more loving pace, as he placed his free hand on her lap and began to massage her right leg. Oh dear wife of mine, you must be patient. Cerberus is very busy and can't always come whenever you miss him, my dear. Plus I feel somewhat alone whenever he is here, as you seem to give him more of your attention than you do with me. Hades said in a fake sad voice, as he made a few sobs just to add a bit more to his little act, which only served to earn him a few silly giggles from his wife, which had been the point from the beginning. Oh dear me, has my husband always been such a jealous little boy? Has he, Lord Hades? Persephone said jokingly, even giggling a bit afterwards as her husband shook his head happily, finding his and her conversations to always leave him in good spirits. Those said spirits were about to vanish, if only for a moment, as the Reaper coughed into his hand, gaining the attention of the two monarchs before him. Neither were happy with their time together being interrupted, but even so they had a job to do, and one they wouldn't like to mess up. "What is it, Marvin?" Hades asked, as he put his icy blue eyes on the Reaper called Marvin, who gulped instantly at the sudden eye contact with his king and master. But even so he went down on one knee, lowering his bony head and hollowed eyes, as he began to give his report. "I have finished my mission to assist Mr. Selzen in attacking the false heavenly dragon Issei. I have also ripped and broken some of his possessions, and I have even found some very useful information on him for you, Lord Hades and Lady Persephone, to use against him, just as you wished," Marvin said confidently, feeling proud at his achievement with his first big assignment. Though the same could not be said for his masters, as while he was beaming with pride in his achievement, they looked at him with horror, wondering if he knew what he had just said and unfortunately just done. Marvin, right?" Persephone asked cautiously at first, wanting to see how Hades would react, though he seemed to keep quiet and watched her for now, letting her continue. "Yes, my lady," Marvin asked, and thanks to his current state of unneeded pride for an undead like himself, he didn't notice the faint caution Persephone had in her voice. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" Persephone shouted as she jumped off of her seat on Hades' lap and stormed right over towards the small Reaper, who now was scared and confused at the sudden shift in tone from his master. "Do you know what you have just said? Do you realize the consequences of your actions? Do you understand whose wrath you have just brought upon us and the entirety of Olympus?" Persephone asked angrily as she kept stomping closer to the small figure who began to crawl away from her, scared of each of her anger-induced stomps, as just a single one could spell the end of him. I just did what you asked of me. As Lower Road Apollo told me. I didn't know. "I am sorry, my lady," Marvin cried out as he reached one of the sapphire-colored pillars near the throne, with him covering himself in his arms in a desperate hope to survive Persephone's anger. "That's enough, my love, I will deal with this." Hades interrupted them, making Persephone watch Marvin's shaking body for a moment, wondering what to do, but decided that whatever her husband would do with Marvin would be way worse than her stomping his head in with her heel. "As you wish, my lord Hades. I will leave this idiot in your capable hands," Persephone said as she walked over to the now empty throne, as Hades had walked over to where Persephone had stood only a few seconds ago. So now Persephone was on the throne, with Hades looming over Marvin, who was still covering next to one of the main pillars of the room. "You better tell me everything that my nephew asked of you in my name or else," Hades said, his tone was stern, and his head, if only for a moment, showed his true ivory face, with his icy blue eyes suddenly going ablaze with blue flames. Needless to say, Hades was less than pleased with his nephew's actions, and if not for Marvin's former loyal actions, then he would shortly after this interrogation be looking in his graveyard for a new Reaper to replace him. Underworld, gates to the rings of hell. In a small, yet almost ancient, region of the wastelands of the underworld, stood a ring of tall and cursed mountains. From the land surrounding it, it looks ordinary, yet the feeling it gives off would make many, if not all, beings run away from it. But that feeling made only really sense if one was to look at it from above in the skies. Inside of the first ring of mountains was another and another within that one, and so on. There were in total 9 rings, or rather circles, with a single hole in the middle of it all, making it look like an eye of various colors around the main black part. Though it wasn't an eye as much as it was the very place where Lucifer himself crashed into when God kicked him out of heaven, with his generals and other satans hitting the many areas around his crash site. Each of them, unknowingly, left behind all of their angelic magic and parts of their new demonic magic. These two magics mixed together into a twisted mass, thus making up the 9 circles of hell, with each circle having its own flavor or punishment for humans who had sinned. It was called, at least by God himself, the Eye of Sin, as it represented the sins of his sons and daughters and even his own. No being ever went there, at least not by their own will, well, no normal being. But on this special day, a pair of beings had made the daunting journey to stand at the gates of it. One was a woman of godly beauty, with bright orange hair, made to look like a fire, but instead of going up, it went down her back. She wore Shinto clothes, with a long and beautiful cape of sorts, covering her beautiful orange and red dress, underneath its own flowery and sunny designed yellow cloth. She was Amaterasu, the Shinto goddess of the sun. She was currently bickering with her companion, as she herself felt he was being an idiot for the stunt he had just made, plus she wanted to be the one to have done it. "I am just saying, Apollo, that if you were going to try and kill him again, then maybe you could have at least told me, so we could have done it in a better way," Amaterasu yelled, making her hair like fire when it was being fueled with a strong wind. Apollo just rolled his golden eyes as he adjusted his Greek armor, not caring fully what his companion was saying to him. This was mostly thanks to his enormous ego that he had developed over his many years of living. He wore sun-tanned Greek armor, with small images of his chariot in him and his sister firing their arrows, with the sun and moon flying after each of their separate arrows. The sun flying after him, and the moon flying after hers. He wore no pants, as most Olympians do, but he did have a small shirt underneath, since he knew where they were going, and he knew it was going to get cold in there real fast. Okay, whatever. He spoke uncaringly, as he did his last checkup, before finally making eye contact with the angry sun goddess. Now then, let's get going. I have a date today, I won't miss it no matter what. Apollo said demandingly, as he began to march through the gates of hell, not caring that Amaterasu was confused and also unaware of his plans. But besides that, the sun goddess ran up beside him and followed him with a curious look. So why are we here? I doubt it's for the historic sites. She asked, while she clutched her cape around herself tighter, as a slow, yet bone-chilling cold began to touch her and his body. Apollo felt a slight shiver at the feeling of it, yet he did not care, and instead smirked. Did you know that this place works much in the same way as Tartarus does? Apollo asked, as he took another confident and slight fire-imbued step into the now much colder and icer landscape. Amaterasu became confused at what he meant, until she remembered what Tartarus was, one of, if not the best prison in the supernatural world. Yeah, it's a giant-ass prison that roams the dimensional gap. So is this place like it then? She asked, receiving a nod from Apollo before he stopped dead in his tracks and began to scout out the frozen spicks and landscapes before them. This place, much like Tartarus, is a prison. And like Tartarus, it will lead you to what you seek inside of it. And what I seek is a certain prisoner whose abilities I would like to use for my plans. Apollo said with a confident tone, as he seemed to locate his prisoner and began to walk towards him, with Amaterasu right behind him, wondering who this prisoner could be. So who are they? Are they a god, some ancient dragon, is it one of your hundreds of heroes? Amaterasu was curious to know what Apollo had found and wanted to use from this place. After all, this place is like Tartarus, so in that sense some really powerful beings should be sealed and kept here. Oh no, not at all. He is pathetically weak compared to Issei, but strong enough to leave some damage. But that's not what I need him for anyway. Here we go. Apollo said, before becoming slightly exhausted at seeing his new minion, or maybe more accurately new tool. Amaterasu looked over at what he was looking at, expecting to be impressed by what he found. She only ended up more confused at the sight of the old crow. His leathery white face, with many elven-like features, not to mention his blood-red eyes, made her feel a weird sense wanting to just give up already. She knew this being, because he had been with Azazel to talk with her faction about joining their side, but thanks to him, it had not gone that way. Seriously, you're gonna free Cacabriel? Of all the beings you could find in here, you're gonna free a bucking warmonger? Amaterasu asked, baffled by Apollo's stupid choice. But she only earned a slight chuckle from Apollo, before he raised his hand up and began to emit a strong heat from the palm of it. Yes, I am gonna free the warmonger of the Great War, Cacabriel. He is going to help me succeed in our plans, since I know thanks to my powers, that he still has a role to play in this world of ours. The cold and hardened ice that was holding on to Cacabriel began to melt slowly, making the old crow begin to move his eyes as his body heat began to return to him slowly. He only continued to become more alive from then on, as for each second that passed, the ice melted further and further. His body heat began to increase as he used his own magic to melt himself free from inside the ice block. Until it finally broke through and out he came, flying with one singular pair of wings, screaming into heavens for joy at being freed. Finally, Azazel, I will kill you for what you have done. Hey buddy, come down here would you? Apollo yelled up at the overjoyed warmonger. Cacabriel looked down at the two gods, confused at who they were, until he noticed their godly amounts of magic and power that was practically just slipping out. He flew down near them, but as he landed his legs gave out, thanks to his many decades in ice, plus his lack of food. His legs were rather weak, and so was his body. Thank you for saving me, Lord Apollo. But I am guessing you didn't do this out of the kind cut it with a nice going routine crow. I only did this because I need your talents, nothing else. Apollo interrupted him in his fake gratefulness. Fine then, what do you need from someone like me? I couldn't possibly deal with a problem that even you, the strongest of the solar gods, couldn't deal with himself. Cacabriel said, mocking both of them at the same time, through a rather sarcastic compliment. True to that, but I don't need you to kill what even I can't kill, I just need you to make him feel like life is no longer worth it. Apollo said, smirking evilly as he watched the old crow get slowly off his ass as he thought over Apollo's request. What do I get out of it? He asked, curious to know of his reward for doing something like this, to which Apollo practically began to smile in response. I won't kill you afterwards, plus I'll even hide you away from your former faction. Apollo said, before reaching a hand out a physical way of sealing their contract. And all you need to do is kill Issei's new little girlfriend, the Red Dragon Empress, Jolina. Can you do that? Apollo asked as he motioned towards his still hanging open left hand as he waited for Cacabriel to take it. At that Cacabriel became quiet for a moment before a massive and practically psycho smile began to appear on his face. So even he is still alive after all this time. I can finally punish him and his pathetic rival Volley after all this time, Cacabriel thought before grabbing Apollo's hand with his right one. I'll do it, Lord Apollo. Cacabriel said, smiling evilly himself, with Apollo joining him with one as well. Only Amaterasu was not smiling, as she could practically see their combined downfall because of this. And it all started with Cacabriel not hearing who was the current Red Dragon Emperor of the two people Apollo mentioned, as he only reacted to Issei's name, as it was one of the three people he wanted to take revenge on the most. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown in left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.